Tell me, Dave, is traditional Agile fast enough for today's needs?
That's a really interesting question. So this is Dave West, a CEO here at Scrum.org, and we obviously spend a lot of time thinking about the future of Scrum and the relevance of Scrum in the context of an ever-changing landscape of delivery options and technology. So is Scrum relevant in the modern age, right? Is in this age of technology where we can deliver something to the web, to our customers in nanoseconds or certainly seconds. I think the question actually is a little bit broader than that, though. I think the question is, are you working as a team? Do you have stakeholders? Is the problem full of uncertainty? Those things are the reason why we have Scrum, not because of the way in which you deliver.
Okay. So you say it's not so much a question of how fast we have to deliver, but rather a general question how we collaborate when we're producing things, when we're developing things. That's the
E-
idea?
e- Exactly. I mean, a lot of people think that the sprint is a release cadence. It's
Right.
not. It's a planning and review cadence. You should release as frequently as you possibly can during a sprint, obviously being mindful of, quality and the
Mhm.
impact of the things that you release. But ultimately, the objective of the sprint review is not to get your stakeholders to sign off on a release. What they're doing actually is reviewing the work that you've done against the goal that you set. We call it a sprint
Mhm.
goal.
Mhm.
And then you determine, have you made progress on it? What have you learned? By making things transparent to your stakeholders, you might get some insights that you hadn't seen before, which then allows you to then plan the next sprint. Ultimately, the sprint cadence is designed around enabling the team to work together in an effective way with a clear goal. A sprint really is just, maybe we should have renamed it from sprint to, I know, goal box. Now, that doesn't sound right either, but you know what I mean. It's a time box to deliver a
Yeah.
goal, right? And I guess you call it penalty box. That's kind of like the goal box, isn't it? But anyway, so the idea of the sprint is to focus the team on a goal, and as long as it's less than 30 days, it can be any amount of time that you want. At Scrum.org, we work in often work in weekly sprints, because it allows us to. Everybody knows when things are happening. We know when sprint planning is happening. We know when, when the sprint review happens. We know, and that regular cadence is about reducing the complexity of working with other people. It's not about the delivery technology that we're using. And the more uncertainty you have in the problem, you probably want to reduce the length of your sprint, because ultimately you want those stakeholders involved more frequently.
So I want to have a faster learning. I want to test my hypothesis faster, and so I go in shorter sprints, shorter time.
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
but so I believe like one thing that's very important, and I do agree that very often people mix up those two things, is that it's one thing in which rhythm or at what time you deploy, and the other thing is how you organize your work, because those bulks of work, they may go together with releases, deployed releases, or they may be larger parts, smaller parts, whatever. So if we always hear this argument that like companies like Amazon are releasing on a minute basis or something like that, then that does not have anything to do with the way we well, it obviously everything has to do with everything, but it does not say it's not a smart idea to have a sprint period of like, let's say, a week or so. That's not contradicting.
Exactly. Now, if your stakeholders sit on your, next to you, when I say next to you, I mean virtually or physically, meaning they're very accessible, and that the dialogue is continuing, and everything's happening in that way. Or if you've got an incredibly small team, then perhaps Scrum isn't perfect for you. However, though, and maybe I'm biased here, I would recommend that you systematically go through the things that Scrum has, and say, do we need this? How are we going to do it? For instance, retrospective. So people often argue we're continuously improving, man. We don't need a separate, like, hour-long meeting or whatever to do it. Fair play to you if you're doing that. My experience is that it's really hard to be continuously improving. And it's much, particularly if you're with other people, it's good to have that moment. It's like therapy or going to see your coach, right? Stepping back from the day to day for a period of time that has some regularity or cadence can really help. And I think that has a big impact. So I'm not saying you have to use Scrum. Obviously, I'm a little biased, and I would encourage you to do it. But at least look at the ideas that Scrum has in place, because millions of people use it every day, and they're not all idiots.
Okay. Uh, Still, let's perhaps look at it from the other point of view. If we see that Scrum was developed more than 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, by Jeff
Yeah,
and Ken, I mean, this was the time when we still had deployment on the basis of DVDs or something, some technologies like that. And now we are having not only the business managed IT with stuff like robotic process automation, with AI, generative AI, that helps making things much easier and extremely more faster. So we see the technology obviously has changed, especially in the IT field within those 30 years. What are the points where you would say you have to really look at the ideas from back then and perhaps have to really reconsider if something should be changed?
I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. I really do think that the majority of the ideas are pretty timeless and agnostic of the technology. And frankly, they were developed a long time before Scrum, and Scrum just brought them together in a structured way, as it were. Empiricism. Apparently some Greek and Roman dudes were mucking about with that, thousands of years ago, right? That concept of empirical process, continuous improvement. Well, Toyota obviously made it famous, but if you read any of the autobiographies of these gentlemen scientists, of the Victorian age, the continuous improvement was fundamental. They were always trying, right? Combine that with empiricism, and you've got this sort of mantra. The one thing that I think is going to be interesting in the future is the size of the teams and whether we really need them in the way that we've historically needed them. Particularly when Ken and Jeff were working, specialization of skill was crucial. You'd have a database expert, you'd have an app server expert, you'd have a UX expert. The reality is that maybe, and I say the reality is, I don't think we're quite here yet, but the idea is that maybe you can have agents that ultimately become these experts. I know personally, it's the end of the year here in America, and so I'm, taking large amounts of complicated financial data, complicated to me, any normal accountant would spend 5 minutes and go, that's simple. Anyway, and throwing it into a chat GPT local instance and having it do some analysis for me. And, things that I would historically have asked an accountant to do, or somebody that's better at math than me. The reality is that we're getting close to the point where you can assemble a team of these agents, and which then, are you working on your own? Do you need to collaborate with these specialists to deliver a valuable increment? I don't know. The one thing, though, I don't think is going to change is in a large company in particular, is getting access to stakeholders. I was talking to a consumer packaged goods company over the holiday period, and he showed me his schedule on Teams, because he pulled it up, shared the screen. Literally trying to get access to this person is, I mean, talk about a complex problem. So the one thing, Scrum provides that idea that having a regular cadence during a pursuit of a we call it a product goal, but some sort of goal, actually provides some level of stability in this otherwise ever-changing environment. So I guess the short answer is I question the role of teams, and then do you need teams? Could a product person literally do it all themselves with limited understanding of the actual implementation technology and a really good understanding of the problem and the domain? Um, don't know. That's an interesting question.
I think that's one of the big changes we're going to experience within the next few years. I did an episode with Henrik Nieberg, and he's very much into hybrid teams with AI agents and humans. But I also would think we are not there yet. But I think you pointed out one thing that's very, very interesting. You said on the one hand, we need Scrum, Agile methods, classical Agile methods, or traditional methods to improve the collaboration, to get the team together with different perspectives and knowledge profiles. And on the other hand, and I think I would agree with you, as long as the organizations stay the way they are now, we have the thing of the stakeholders involvement, getting commitment, change management, convincing people. And as the corps are structured nowadays, I mean, it's always a huge number of persons you have to involve there. And that, at least as we stay in the old structure, does not change because we still have the same old way of deciding things.
Yeah. And I think that I think organizations ultimately, the realization I've come to is they're not built to deliver, maintain products or deliver value to customers or even support shareholder value. That happens, but it happens in the context of really a social system that is required for countries and societies and people to survive. Um, the reality is that you most modern organizations could be ridiculously more efficient with the application of technology, the removal of politics, the removal of status, authority, and power needs that human beings naturally have. If you did that, what happened at Twitter with Elon Musk, and I'm not advocating Elon Musk as a change agent. I think he's a little abrupt and not necessarily very pleasant. But what he did at Twitter is he well over half got rid of half the employees. And actually, if you look at their delivery cadence, you look at their innovation, he might not agree with what is innovating, but is innovation. They've actually increased those capabilities. Now, Twitter isn't the same as, a large, Deutsche Bank or BMW or Daimler or any of these companies. Totally understand that. However, I do think that that changing those organizations is incredibly hard and has huge ramifications and requires fundamental shifts at many levels in both humans and society that those humans live in. So I don't see that changing in the short term, bottom line.
Aren't we now also talking about the thing of which is also being discussed as scaling agile, as we do have those values and principles that are like the fundamental ideas and the basics of, for example, Scrum. And then we are trying to get this into larger organizations with scaled agile approaches. And I sometimes do have the feeling that the initiatives to become more agile on team level seem to be more successful more often than on the corporate level.
Oh, totally, 100% agree. And I think, as Dean Leffingwell would say, it's ultimately scaling agile is all about compromise and choosing the compromises. And that's the reason why Craig and Baz with less say, no, it's not. And therefore, they have a very, very strong opinion, and less is only necessarily relevant for a very, very small percentage of organizations because of that. Whereas scaled agile is more relevant for more organizations because you don't have to change as much. You don't have to, compromise as much. The fundamental question that, that you're asking at the start of this podcast is, with the advent of new technology and the implications of that, LLMs, etc., the fact that you can write a fully working web app in less than a day, if you know what the problem you're trying to solve is and you've bought the right domains, etc. Will this lead to a massive change to organizational structures, which will then remove those compromises necessary for scaling? And and that is the question. But when I look at, we've had these many, the financial crisis of, what was that, 2009,
2009.
8? Yeah. Gosh, it seems such a long time ago. There was many of those organizations should have failed and new companies become, move into their place. That didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the impact in society was too bigger to bear. And, if you go around these organizations, I'm not sure they're willing to change. I think it will take time, to quote a Bob Dylan song, times are a-changing, but sung at a very slow cadence.
Okay. So this might also be like in perspective that the agile principles and values are going to become even more important and relevant in the world to come, with new technologies to come, which would also mean that we finally change not so much the team structures, but rather the structures of the corporates.
I really, really hope that, and we're seeing the emergence of product, right, as a way of organizing and product thinking, which ultimately is around, if you, Marty Kagan, Melissa Perry, all these amazing thought leaders, it's about experimentation, it's about empowerment, it's about moving responsibility down. When you look at things like lean portfolio management from SAFe, it looks remarkably like a waterfall traditional compromise. So I actually do believe that agility is going to become even more relevant in the future. And I think some of the things that undermine its adoption at scale today will be removed, but they will take time. And a colleague of mine says, he quotes a science quote. He goes, "Science progresses one funeral at a time." And I don't want to be quite that extreme, but I think that change like this, we're talking, it's 2025. We're talking people that were born after the millennium and now a couple of years into their jobs. How crazy is that? As an old geezer like me, and I think you're of the similar age, these people are digital natives. They can't even remember not having a cell phone in their pocket. They can't remember, having to write checks, or that will change the organizations around it. Now, how they collaborate is interesting. Their how they work with others is different. And perhaps because of COVID, perhaps because of whatever. So I do believe, but from a practical point of view, and I know your listeners are sitting there going, "Hey, this is deep, man, and this is cool, and let's have another glass of wine." But the practical thing is, what it means the future is understanding problems, problem curation, problem definition, understanding stakeholders, understanding value, being able to effectively measure value, being able to cite hypothesis, or experiments, or, understand the impact of something and be able to measure its outcome, is going to be even more important, because the tools that we're providing are going to basically remove the need to develop the solutions. They're going to emphasize the importance of problem definition. Future programming languages aren't about solutions, they're about problems. And and I think if I'm, and you probably, that your listeners are probably already thinking this, but if I was younger, if I was in my 30s or whatever, and not thinking that I'm going to retire in 5 or so years, building those skills around design thinking, around, thinking about root cause analysis, understanding networks, measurement, hypothesis development, experimentation, it's sort of like that. Those sort of skills are going to be crucial for everybody, even people that today are writing code and somebody else does all that for them. I think it's going to be a single person probably doing that.
So looking at the clock to wrap it up, what I understand is that especially the ideas, the values, the principles behind Agile, they are not only still relevant, but perhaps even more relevant than ever, and they are even going to be even more relevant with new technologies, new setups. We perhaps should really look at the specific frameworks and how we are living them, but does not mean in general that we have to change everything, but we just have to go back to the why, as we should always have done. And we should be especially critical about the big structures, because there we haven't become as agile as we would have wanted to or should have been in the long run anyway. So is that a way of wrapping it up?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think and my words of wisdom for what they're worth, are remember to focus on the problems, focus on the people and the problems. And, the technology is going to become so abstracted, you'll be out, the technology will better work out the solutions itself.
So focus on the people, focus on the problems, no matter what the technology is. And especially if the technology is even better than today's, then that's even more important. Dave.
Exactly.
Dave, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always fun to chat.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.